My name is Eleanor Vance, but everyone calls me Eliza. I am 32, a primary school teacher in Bristol. In theory, the summer holidays are a blessing. 2 months of reprieve. 2 months to breathe, to prepare for the next term, to read something other than curriculum guides. 2 months to be Eliza again, and not just Mrs. Vance. This morning, the first true day of freedom, the air was soft. I was in our small garden, my hands in the soil. The scent of the basil and the cherry tomatoes I had just watered. My son, Leo, 5 years old, was building an improbable sandcastle in his little patch. He was quiet. I was quiet. The city seemed distant. It was the perfect silence. A silence full of promises. Then, the vibration. On the wrought iron table, my phone, a sharp, intrusive sound. I wiped my hands on my apron. The screen showed the name, Sarah Lewis, my sister-in-law, based in London. Mark, my husband's older sister. My heart contracted very slightly, out of habit, out of anticipation. I opened the message. It was not a question. It was a list of orders, a declaration of logistical war disguised as a family request. Eliza, hope you're enjoying the sun. The beginning was always falsely kind. Just confirming the boys' arrival on the 3rd of July. Owen only eats pizza and burgers. Absolutely no green vegetables. Finn needs meat at every meal. Beef, preferably. He's growing fast. You'll need to take them out once a week. The countryside will do, but watch their safety. They are rambunctious. And with this heat, don't be stingy, put the air conditioning on. Kisses. I stood motionless. The sun beat on my neck, but I felt cold. A dry, nervous laugh rose in my throat. A laugh that sounded like a strangled animal. Leo looked up from his castle. Are you okay, Mom? Yes, darling. I'm perfectly fine. I reread the lines. Don't be stingy. Me, who counts every penny to give Leo a decent holiday. Me, who has worn the same sandals for 3 summers. Don't be stingy. I looked at my garden, my basil, my tomatoes. Simple things that grow with water and care. Nothing to do with Sarah's demands. Nothing to do with her 2 little monsters. Owen 11 and Finn 9. That evening, when Mark came home, I didn't say anything right away. Mark is an engineer. He is a good man, a stable man, a man who hates conflict more than anything. Perhaps that's why I married him, and perhaps that's why I was beginning to drift away from him. He kissed Leo, poured himself a glass of water. He smiled. So, how was the first day of the holiday? Paradise? I held out the phone. He didn't need to read the message. He saw the name Sarah. His smile froze. He read it. I watched his face, the slight furrow of his brow, the tension in his jaw, then the sigh, that sigh, the sound of surrender, the sound of my imminent resignation. Come on, darling. Don't get worked up. He didn't even look at my face. My sister has always been like that, a little direct. Direct? I said, my voice lower than intended. She acts like the Queen of England, Mark. She sends us her children like a parcel, with an instruction manual fit for a faulty electronic device. Eliza, don't be stingy. Mark put down his glass. He finally looked up at me, tired, pleading. She's my sister. And she's always been good to me. When Mom got sick, she took care of everything. I owe her a lot. Him, not us. Him, the debt. The word was out. The one that justifies everything. The one that excuses everything. The one he was asking me, to repay on his behalf. Just put up with them for a month, all right? For me, a month. A month of cold pizza and burgers. A month of shouting in the house. A month where Leo would be ignored by his older, louder cousins. A month where I, Eliza, would become the free nanny for the Queen Sarah. Last year, I had given in. Naive. I told myself it would be good for Leo. An only child. I told myself he would be less bored. Life, there was plenty of it. Too much. I remember the smell of smoke. Owen and Finn had tried a barbecue in the garden, using magnifying glasses and dry leaves, right next to Leo's shed. I remember the sound. My mother's tea set. An heirloom. The only thing of value I owned. Shattered on the floor, because they were playing football in the living room. Then the lie. It was Leo! Leo did it! Owen, looking me straight in the eye, impassive. Leo, in tears. And the call to Sarah, her metallic voice. My boys don't lie. Sarah, I was there. You're a teacher. Manage. You're cold, Eliza. You've never liked my children. You're jealous because Mark is closer to me than he is to you. The humiliation, the cold rage. And Mark, who murmured, "They're just kids." He had not defended his son, nor me. I swore that night, never again. And here it was, a year later. The same message, the same demands, and the same man, my husband, asking me to put up with it. I looked at him. This man I had loved for his gentleness. But gentleness, when it becomes an absence of courage, is poison. A slow poison. "You're dead, Mark? Or my peace?" He didn't understand, or he pretended not to. "What are you talking about? You cannot ask me to pay for something I don't owe. You cannot ask me to sacrifice my summer, my rest, the safety of my son, to repay your sister. Don't exaggerate. I'm just stating a fact." He looked away. Again, he retreated to the kitchen to pour another glass of water. An escape, an ordinary cowardice. It was not an earthquake. It was not a shout. It was a crack, a hairline fracture that had just run through our marriage. And I knew, at that precise moment, that it would never close. The night after the message, sleep evaded me. The crack, so fine, felt like a canyon in the dark room we shared. Mark was breathing the steady, deep rhythm of the untroubled. Or perhaps the willfully oblivious. I lay there, tracing the familiar lines of the ceiling with my eyes, and all I could see was a ledger. The dead. Mark's mother, my mother-in-law, had suffered a long decline. Sarah, Mark's older sister, living closer to the family home in the suburbs of London, had managed the bulk of the logistics. Doctors, appointments, bills, and the endless, suffocating grief that comes with watching a parent fade. Mark, already settled in Bristol with me, provided financial support and weekend visits. But Sarah was the primary custodian of the suffering. And in Mark's mind, that created an indelible obligation, a mortgage on his soul, payable in perpetual compliance. What I resented was not the debt itself, but that the interest was being paid by me, and now by Leo. I slipped out of bed just before dawn. The house was cold and quiet. I walked to the garden. My basil leaves were damp with dew, sharp and aromatic when I brushed past them. That scent, that small, living thing, was my anchor. It was pure. It had no debt, no history, only growth and the present moment. I realized then that this was the geography of my life. The clean, quiet, simple world I cultivated in my garden and classroom, contrasted with the complicated, demanding, historical world of the Vance family dynamic. Mark constantly tried to bridge the two, but he always dragged my peace toward their chaos, never the other way around. He saw compromise as me bending. He never considered bending toward me. That morning, I made pancakes. Leo was delighted. Mark was overly cheerful, an attempt to paste over the fracture from the night before. His kindness was often a shield, deflecting difficult conversations rather than solving the underlying issue. "Smells amazing, Elle. You didn't have to do all this," he said, kissing my cheek with exaggerated affection. I served the pancakes. "I wanted to. It's the holidays, remember? A little bit of paradise." He caught the edge in my voice. His eyes flickered down to his plate. "Look, about Sarah's text." I preempted him, speaking softly. "I know what you need me to say, Mark. You need me to say, 'It's fine, we'll manage, for you.'" He sighed, relieved, taking a large bite. "It's just for a few weeks, love. I'll make it up to you. We'll take a weekend away afterward. Just the two of us." The promise was an insult, a bribe to cover my submission. He was promising me compensation for the emotional labor I was about to undertake. But he refused to acknowledge the fundamental breach of trust. He was prioritizing his sister's convenience over his wife and son's well-being. This wasn't just a logistical disagreement. It was a revelation of priorities. "Mark," I continued, keeping my voice level. "Last year, Owen called Leo a crybaby for being upset about the tea set. They tried to set the shed on fire. Sarah called me cold and jealous. She was stressed. And they are just children, Elle. Boys push boundaries. I'll speak to them this time. I promise. I'll be tougher." "You shouldn't have to be tougher, Mark. You should be our advocate. Their mother should be teaching them respect. And my husband should be defending his family's home and dignity." He slumped back in his chair, the false cheer gone. "And what am I supposed to do? Tell her no? She'll never speak to me again, Eliza. You know how she is. She'll cut me off. She'll make me feel guilty for the rest of my life about Mom." That was the crux of it. Mark was paralyzed by the fear of Sarah's emotional tyranny. He was 34 years old, a successful engineer, but his sister still held him captive with the invisible chains of old family grievance. And he was dragging me into the cell with him. "I won't ask you to do that," I said, looking away, the pancakes suddenly tasting like ash. "I won't ask you to fight your sister. I will ask you to choose your wife and son. We are not your sister's free summer camp, Mark. We are your primary family now, the one you created." Leo, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stopped playing with his syrup. He looked from me to his father, his large, sensitive 5-year-old eyes wide. This was the second layer of betrayal, exposing Leo to this strain. He was already inheriting the tension. Later that day, while Leo was napping, I walked into Mark's home office. He was working remotely, fiddling with a complex structural design on his monitor. He looked so capable, so rational, solving problems of geometry and physics. Yet, he was utterly incapable of solving the simple, messy geometry of human relationships. I didn't speak about Sarah. I spoke about my childhood. "I was 8 years old," I began, leaning against the doorframe. "My father was a quiet man, just like you. My mother, she was a vibrant woman, Mark, full of life. But my father's sister, Auntie Carol, was always there, demanding, borrowing money she never repaid, criticizing Mom's cooking, her clothes, our house, and Dad never said a word, ever." Mark continued to stare at his screen, but his fingers stopped typing. He knew where I was going. I remember one Christmas. Auntie Carol made a huge scene because Mom bought her a scarf instead of a cash gift. She threw it back across the room, Mark. Mom just picked it up, folded it, and put it in the box. And Dad, sitting right there, just cleared his throat and changed the subject to the weather. The memory was sharp. The shame and helplessness of watching my mother shrink still burned. Mom was broken by the time I was a teenager, not by poverty or illness, but by the slow, corrosive poison of being permanently unsupported, of being the designated sacrifice. I stepped closer to his desk. She stopped painting. She stopped singing her silly songs. She became just Mom, the housekeeper, the absorber of insults. She lived her last year's gray, Mark, because she confused quiet suffering with family duty. And my father confused peace with cowardice. I looked him in the eyes, demanding his attention. I promised myself I would never be that woman. I promised I would never let my child watch me disappear in silence. And yet, when Leo cried last summer because your nephew lied and you didn't correct it, when you let Sarah insult me without a single word of defense, I realized I was repeating the pattern, Mark. I am replicating my mother's fatal error. I am passing on the inheritance of the quiet woman who is slowly erased. The silence in the small office was enormous. The only sound was the whir of his computer fan. He finally dropped his gaze from the screen, his face etched with a defensive frustration. "That's unfair, Eliza. I am nothing like your father. And you are not your mother. You are stronger than she was." Strong doesn't mean infinite, Mark. Strong means I know when to stop carrying a load that isn't mine. Your debt to Sarah is yours. It ends with you, not with Leo having to surrender his peace to her spoiled, destructive children, not with me having to endure her moral superiority. He stood up, walking away from the desk, circling the small room. He looked trapped. "So what do you want? For me to call her and tell her, no, you can't come? Do you want me to destroy my relationship with my only sister?" "I want you to protect this one," I whispered, gesturing around the room to the quiet life we had built. "I want you to draw a boundary. If you can't tell her no, then I will. But I need to know you will stand with me when the inevitable backlash comes. I need you to finally choose the truth of your present over the guilt of your past." He stopped circling, his back to me. His silence was the answer. It wasn't a verbal refusal, but a physical one, a wall. He was unwilling to take the heat. He wanted me to stand in the fire alone. And in that moment, standing in the filtered light of his office, the crack didn't just widen. A piece broke off. A small, painful shard of love for the man I thought he was fell away. The realization was stark. His gentleness was not a virtue. It was the mechanism of his betrayal. He wasn't kind. He was just conflict-averse, and he preferred me to absorb the consequences of his aversion. I left the office. I didn't need to hear his compromised agreement or his half-hearted promises. I had my answer. The battle wasn't with Sarah. The true battle, the one that determined the fate of my soul and my son's future, was right here, in this house, with the man I had married. Later that afternoon, I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. Leo was quietly drawing at the small table, occasionally humming to himself. He drew a stick figure family, a mother, a father, and a little boy. The figures had disproportionately large, smiling heads. He was drawing the peace he craved. Mark came in, holding his phone. His expression was a mixture of anxiety and forced resolution. "I spoke to Sarah," he said quickly, avoiding my eyes. My heart hammered against my ribs. "And?" "I told her we're looking forward to seeing them. I said I'd make sure the boys are well behaved this year. I told her I'd handle the logistics." The air went out of my lungs. He hadn't just not supported me. He had actively undermined the conversation we just had. He had sacrificed my peace and my conviction for the sake of an easy phone call. "You chose," I said, the words feeling heavy and foreign on my tongue. "You chose your debt." He flinched. "I chose peace, Eliza. I chose the path of least resistance. She's coming. Just let it go." He walked past me to the fridge, the casual dismissal a final stinging blow. He thought my principles were just a mood he could wait out. I stood over the cutting board, the knife poised over a carrot. My hand was shaking, not with rage, but with a terrible cold clarity. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw anything. I simply put the knife down. I looked at Leo, tracing the happy lines of his drawing. He looked up, his humming stopping, his small face questioning. He was watching me. He was learning how a woman should react when she is betrayed by the man she trusts. He was learning how he should treat women. I would not let him learn that silence and surrender were the appropriate responses. I would cut the chain here. "Mark," I said, his name a sharp sound in the quiet kitchen. "Leo is not going to spend his summer in fear. I'm not going to let him be punished again for the convenience of others." He was still by the fridge, drinking water. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about ending the inheritance," I stated. My voice strong, steady, and utterly devoid of emotion. The inheritance of being the woman who has to pay for everyone else's peace. They will come, but they will not stay here. They will not touch my son's things. They will not be my responsibility. That is ridiculous. Where will they go? Who will look after them? We agreed. You agreed, Mark. I did not. The house is small. The house is full. The house is ours. They are not coming in. You can tell Sarah. Or I will. But know this. From now on, I will not only protect my peace, but I will protect the small, sensitive boy who is watching me right now. I refuse to let the wounds from your family debt pass into the next generation. He stood there, the glass held halfway to his mouth, frozen in the moment of his ordinary cowardice, colliding with my absolute, unprecedented resolve. Mark's hand, holding the glass, never reached his mouth. The water remained suspended, a tiny, crystal-clear moment of absolute pause. For the first time since I'd known him, he didn't blink away the uncomfortable truth. He was forced to see the gravity of my decision, not as a tantrum, but as a deliberate, structural change to our life. "You're going to tell my sister she can't stay here?" he finally managed, his voice a tight, low hiss of disbelief. "You know what that will do, Eliza? She'll think you're deliberately driving a wedge. She'll never forgive me." "And what about me, Mark?" I countered, stepping closer, my voice still unnervingly calm. "What will I never forgive you for? For exposing our son to her children's unkindness? For letting her walk into our sanctuary and destroy our peace every summer, all because you're afraid of a phone call? This isn't about a wedge, it's about a foundation. You're letting your past obligations crumble the foundation of your present family." I gestured to Leo, who was still drawing, his small head bent in concentration, but whose humming had completely stopped. He was listening. "Look at him, Mark. He is paying attention. He sees who defends him and who doesn't. He is learning what a home is. Is it a fortress, or is it a free-for-all for the most demanding person in your life?" Mark slammed the glass down on the counter, not shattering it, but hard enough to make the ceramic rattle. "You are being vindictive. You are taking my nephews hostage just to punish me for not being the hero you want." "I am not punishing you, Mark. I am simply refusing to be sacrificed. And they are not hostages. They are children who need their own father, not a reluctant substitute teacher and a free hotel in Bristol. You want to pay your debt? Fine. Book them a room at a local bed and breakfast. Pay for an activity camp. Drive them around yourself. That is how you handle your obligation. You do not delegate my sanity to your sister's convenience." His face flushed with impotent rage. He was used to my patience, my compromise, my quiet endurance. My resistance felt like an act of war, and he had no weapons to fight it. "She's family, Eliza. We do not abandon family." No, I agreed softly. We don't abandon family. And that's why I'm fighting to keep our family, me, you, and Leo, from being abandoned to the demands of others. You are choosing your extended family over your immediate one. And that is a betrayal I cannot live with anymore. The argument devolved into a silent, icy standoff. He stalked out of the kitchen and retreated to the office, slamming the door, a futile gesture that only reinforced his cowardice. He needed the physical barrier between himself and the truth I had just spoken. I knelt beside Leo, who finally looked up, his drawing forgotten. His small hand reached out and touched my cheek. "Are the cousins coming, Mum?" he whispered, his voice small, loaded with dread. I took his hand, holding it firmly. "I don't know, darling, but I know this. No one is going to make you share your toys if you don't want to. No one is going to tell you that you lied, and no one is going to call your mother cold. This summer, our house will be a safe place. I promise." My promise to Leo was my vow to myself. This was the moment I severed the thread that connected me to my mother's fate. The silence of the unsupported woman would not be my legacy. The next morning, I knew I had to act, while my resolve was solid. Mark was still cold, eating his toast in silence, reading the financial news as if his world was perfectly intact. He was waiting for me to back down. He was waiting for my feminine hysteria to pass. I didn't wait. I went to the small garden shed and brought out a large canvas and my old painting supplies. I hadn't touched them since before Leo was born. My mother had stopped painting after one too many cutting remarks from Auntie Carol. I would start again. This was a visible, tangible act of rebellion, reclaiming myself, my space, my joy. I set up the easel in the garden, right beside the basil and the tomatoes. Leo watched, fascinated, as I mixed the vibrant blues and greens. Mark watched, annoyed from the window. Mid-morning, I sat down and composed the message to Sarah. I didn't want Mark to intercept it or to edit my words. This had to be me. I kept the tone professional, almost clinical. No emotion, no room for her usual guilt trip or accusation of jealousy. "Dear Sarah, we are so pleased you are thinking of us for Owen and Finn's summer care. However, due to several pre-existing commitments and the need for Leo to have a quieter period before starting school in September, we will unfortunately be unable to host the boys overnight this year. We are, however, happy to help Mark with his obligations to you. Mark has offered to drive the boys to day-long activities in Bristol once a week, for which we will cover the costs. He is also prepared to fund their accommodation at a nearby B&B for the full 3 weeks, if that simplifies your travel plans. Or you could look into a local summer camp. Please direct all logistical details regarding Owen and Finn's local arrangements, accommodation, dietary needs, etc., to Mark directly. Our home is currently at maximum capacity. Wishing you a peaceful summer, Eliza Vance." I hit send. The instant relief was enormous, like shedding a heavy, wet cloak I didn't realize I was wearing. The message was honest, polite, and most importantly, it was a boundary. I had redirected the responsibility, accommodation, logistics, finance, back to the person who truly owed the debt, Mark. The phone rang almost immediately. It was Sarah. I let it ring. And ring. It went to voicemail. Mark, startled by the persistent ringing, rushed out of the office. "Who is that? Why didn't you answer?" "It's Sarah," I said, dipping my brush into a sharp indigo color. "I just sent her a text." "You what?" He snatched his phone off the table to check his messages. He read my clear, concise refusal, his face going pale, then red. "You didn't even discuss this with me. You told her no. You committed me to paying for a hotel and driving them around. What gives you the right to make unilateral decisions about our finances and my family?" "The right of self-preservation, Mark," I said, looking up at him, my gaze unwavering. "You had 24 hours to choose your family's peace over your sister's demands. You chose her, so I chose us. You want to talk about finances?" The emotional toll of their last visit cost me more than a month at the Grand Hotel. The ensuing storm was exactly what I had feared, and what I knew I had to face. Sarah, having failed to reach me, called Mark, her voice probably screaming down the phone line. Mark shouted, pacing the kitchen, venting his fear and anger at me, because I was present and Sarah was not. "She's furious, Eliza, absolutely ballistic. She said you've always hated her, that you're destroying our family, that you're manipulating me. She said she told you about my mother and you're using her illness against her. She's crying." I continued painting. as a bold stroke of green across the canvas, the color of my freedom. She's using emotional manipulation, Mark. The oldest trick in her book. You know exactly what she's doing. She's making you choose. And if she truly believes that a simple logistical change to her children's sleeping arrangements is destroying your family, then she doesn't care about our family at all. She only cares about her entitlement. My refusal to engage, my quiet, determined focus on my canvas, broke his stride. He stood silent for a moment, seeing the painted defiance, the deliberate calmness that contrasted with his internal turmoil. I hate this, he admitted, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. I hate this conflict. Why couldn't you just wait until I handled it? You wouldn't have, Mark, I said gently, finally lowering the paintbrush. You would have endured another summer, and then another, until I became my mother. I didn't do this to destroy your relationship with Sarah. I did this to save mine with myself, and yours with Leo. I refuse to pass on the wound of being betrayed by a spouse's cowardice. I refuse to let my son inherit the silence. The moment stretched, heavy and profound. He looked at me, then at the phone, then back at me. He saw the cold, hard logic of my protection. He saw the woman he married, yes, but also a new, steel-backed conviction he had never encountered. He didn't agree. He didn't apologize. He simply turned, his shoulders slumped, and walked back to the office to face the continuing fallout from his sister. He had his debt, and now he had to pay it in the currency of conflict, not my sacrifice. I watched the door close behind him. I picked up my brush again. The canvas was still messy, still unfinished, but it was bright, honest, and entirely my own. The first day of my true self-possessed summer had finally begun. The air in the house changed. It didn't become loud, it became thick. The argument had been brief, confined to the kitchen, but the aftershocks resonated through every room. Mark became a ghost. He moved through the house with exaggerated quietness, avoiding my gaze, speaking only in functional necessities. Did Leo eat? The water bill is here. I'm going out for a run. He was punishing me with silence, a tool of passive aggression he had mastered. He was communicating his displeasure without the risk of confrontation, forcing me to live in the atmosphere of his disappointment. I tried to ignore it. I threw myself into the quiet domesticity I had been fighting to save. I spent hours in the garden. The basil was growing tall, its leaves large and lush. The cherry tomatoes were blushing a deep, sun-warmed red. These were things I could control, things that responded linearly to care. If I watered them, they grew. If I tended them, they flourished. They didn't lie, they didn't accuse, and they didn't hold debt over my head. My canvas sat in the corner of the garden, a perpetual work in progress. It was a chaotic swirl of the vibrant colors I felt. The sharp indigo of certainty, the angry red of Mark's reaction, the calming green of the life I wanted. It was my silent scream, a visual diary of my internal emancipation. Leo, my sensitive boy, noticed everything. He wasn't loud or demanding, but he was a keen observer of emotional weather. He stopped asking Mark to read him stories, opting instead to curl up beside me on the sofa while I graded old-school papers. He would often just watch me, his small hand resting lightly on my arm, as if ensuring I was still present, still tangible. One afternoon, I was folding laundry, my mind running through the logistics Mark was now forced to handle. The phone calls to Sarah, the desperate search for a decent, affordable B&B in Bristol, the silent fury he must be enduring from his sister. He had managed to offload the emotional debt onto me, but I had successfully redirected the logistical, painful repayment back to him. The cost, however, was a profound, aching loneliness. I felt like a single parent, fighting a war against an external enemy, only to realize the man who should have been guarding the gate was holding the key for the opponent. Leo was playing quietly, with his small toy cars on the rug. He was stacking them into a multi-story garage. "Mom?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, darling? Are Owen and Finn still coming?" The casual question pierced me like a needle. I stopped folding a towel. "We don't know yet, Leo. Dad is sorting it out." He paused his stacking. He didn't look up, but his next question was loaded with an adult weight that broke my heart. "If they come, do I still have to share my new digger with Owen?" The memory of the shattered tea set flashed through my mind. The image of his small, tear-streaked face when Owen lied and blamed him. He wasn't worried about the digger. He was worried about being forced into surrender. He was worried about the injustice. He was worried about the transaction of peace. No, Leo, I said, moving quickly to his side, kneeling down so I was eye level with him. I took his face gently in my hands. You never have to share anything that makes you feel unsafe or sad. Not if you don't want to. Your things are yours, and our house is our house. It is your safe space. No one is going to make you miserable here. That's a promise. He searched my eyes, looking for the lie, but finding only firm conviction. A deep sigh escaped his small body, a sound of relief that a 5-year-old should never have to make. He immediately went back to his cars. The burden lifted. But for me, the burden had just become heavier. I saw my mother in him. The thought arrived with the force of an actual blow. I remembered my mother, holding my hand tightly at family gatherings, her grip always a little too desperate, a silent plea for me to be good, to be quiet, to make things easy. I realized that my mother's silent suffering hadn't been just a personal tragedy. It had been an invisible, toxic inheritance. It was the genetic predisposition for sacrifice. My mother never explicitly told me to be a martyr, but I watched her. I watched her swallow insults. I watched her retreat into silence when my father refused to defend her. I watched her choose peace at the expense of her own vitality. And by watching her, I learned the lesson. A good woman endures. A good wife compromises her soul for the sake of the family unit, regardless of who is doing the wounding. And now, I saw Leo learning a version of that same lesson. He was learning that the adults around him might require him to submit to unkindness for the sake of keeping the peace. His question about the digger was the trauma manifesting in the next generation. It was the wound of betrayal being passed down. The core message, ta không thể ngăn người khác phản bội, nhưng ta có thể ngăn vết thương đó lặp lại qua thế hệ sau. We cannot stop others from betraying us, but we can stop that wound from repeating through the next generation. Became my mantra. I was not just fighting Sarah's demands. I was fighting my mother's ghost. I was fighting the insidious cultural expectation that a wife's kindness must equate to infinite endurance. That evening, Mark returned late. He looked haggard. He had been on the phone with Sarah for 2 hours. A brutal, exhausting, emotionally manipulative negotiation I was grateful to have missed. He walked into the kitchen, his posture broadcasting defeat. It's done, he announced, his voice flat. She booked them flights for the 3rd of July. I booked them into the old mill B&B 3 miles away. It's expensive, Eliza. Very expensive. And I have to drop them off and pick them up every day. He threw the receipt onto the counter like an accusation. He wanted me to feel guilty for the financial cost, the logistical inconvenience, the tension with his sister. He wanted me to admit my resolve wasn't worth the price. I'm sorry you had to go through that, Mark, I said truthfully, though the word sorry felt heavy. He scoffed. Are you? You got what you wanted. You pushed your own sister-in-law out of our home. You've successfully alienated my only family. I didn't push her out, Mark. I created a boundary. She is still choosing to send her children here. She could have cancelled. She is choosing to maintain her control by forcing you to take over the inconvenience, rather than accepting her own responsibility. And you're allowing her to continue defining your relationship by guilt. You can still have a relationship with her, Mark, but it has to be one built on mutual respect, not on my submission. He leaned against the wall, rubbing his tired face. It's just impossible, Eliza. You don't understand the history. You don't understand how much she sacrificed when Mom was sick. I can't just cut her off over a summer visit. I'm not asking you to cut her off. I'm asking you to put us first, to put Leo first. The history is important, yes. But if your history means I have to become a resentful, silently suffering woman, then that history needs to be contained. You're letting her trauma define our marriage. And our son is noticing. He's already worried about his toys, Mark. He's already learning to anticipate betrayal. My words, stark and unadorned, landed with a sickening thud. He looked genuinely startled, the anger draining away, replaced by a flicker of fear. What do you mean? He's worried about his toys? I recounted the morning's conversation. The small, quiet plea about the digger. I didn't embellish. I just presented the fact of Leo's fear. Mark turned away, his shoulder tense. He's just a kid, Eliza. Kids say things. Kids reflect the environment they live in. He is showing the emotional damage from last year's visit. And you, Mark, are the architect of that damage. By refusing to defend him, you teach him that his father values peace with a difficult relative more than his son's sense of security. That is the wound I refuse to let him inherit. The conversation ended there. not with a resolution, but with a widening chasm. Mark disappeared into his office, presumably to handle more arrangements, or perhaps just to seek refuge in his work. I was left alone in the kitchen, the battle won, but the war for our marriage escalating. I had protected Leo, but in doing so, I had forced Mark to finally confront the cost of his cowardice, a cost he deeply resented paying. I finished my chores in a fog of isolation. Later, sitting in the garden under the weak evening sun, I looked at my canvas again. I picked up the brush, dipping it into a vibrant, defiant gold, the color of true value. It was a recognition. My peace, Leo's security, and my own sense of self-worth were not commodities to be traded for Mark's convenience. They were the gold standard of our family. I sat there until the light faded, the cool air settling over the garden. I thought about my mother and the quiet resignation that eventually overtook her. She hadn't had the language to define her suffering. She hadn't had the courage to tell her husband, "You are failing me." She just accepted the slow, silent sacrifice. I, however, had found my voice. I had refused the generational inheritance of feminine silence, but the success tasted metallic, like blood in my mouth. I had won a battle for self-preservation, only to find myself terribly alone in the aftermath. Mark was physically present, but emotionally absent, trapped in his resentment and fear. The peace I craved was not the absence of conflict, but the deep, shared understanding with my husband. And that, I realized, was now further away than ever. I looked at the house, a dark silhouette against the twilight sky. It was no longer a sanctuary, it was a contested space, divided by the silence of two people who had vastly different definitions of what family truly meant. The days that followed were lived in a state of suspended animation. The weather was classic British summer, intermittent sunshine and soft, gray drizzle, perfectly mirroring the mood inside our house. Mark was now actively engaging with the logistical debt. He spent hours on the phone with the B&B owner, coordinating drop-off times, clarifying dietary restrictions, Owen's relentless demand for only pizza and burgers, and dealing with Sarah's follow-up texts, which were thinly veiled jabs at my hostility. He never showed me these texts, but I could read the fallout on his face, the rigid set of his jaw, the quick defensive shift of his eyes when I entered a room. He was walking on emotional eggshells, and he blamed me for the shattered shells. I had to drive all the way to Bath just to find a gluten-free bread they promised to stock for Finn, he muttered one evening, dropping his car keys onto the table with a theatrical clatter. He was listing his inconveniences, not for empathy, but for condemnation. "That sounds exhausting, Mark," I replied calmly, stirring a pot of tomato soup I'd made from my own garden harvest. "But it is your responsibility. It's what you owed Sarah, and you are paying it. Now you know the true cost of their visit." He flinched at the word cost. "It's not a transaction, Eliza. It's family, and you're treating it like an accounting problem." "It is an accounting problem, Mark. You've let the debt accrue interest for years, and now the principal is due. You wanted me to pay it with my peace, my self-worth, and Leo's security. I refused. So now you'll pay it with your time and your money. That is the only just accounting." He slammed the cupboard door as he retrieved a mug. "You're so cold now. You were never like this. You've become punitive." "I'm not cold, Mark. I am simply clear." Clarity is often mistaken for coldness by those who prefer to live in a comforting fog of avoidance. I was kind, yes, but my kindness was misinterpreted as endless tolerance. And tolerance, when extended to toxic behavior, becomes self-destruction. I watched him. He was a good man, I reminded myself. He was a loving father, but his goodness was structurally flawed. His desperate need for external harmony made him choose the path of least resistance, which in our situation meant throwing me under his sister's bus. His kindness to Sarah was, simultaneously, cruelty to me. This was the smoldering conflict of Act 2. It wasn't about shouting matches. It was about the continuous, grinding weight of his avoidance and my clear, painful recognition of it. Every time he avoided eye contact, every time he used a logistical inconvenience as a weapon against me, the chasm widened. I started taking long walks with Leo by the Avon River. It was a physical and emotional escape. We would watch the narrow boats drift by, simple, steady vessels on the water. I would tell Leo stories, not fairy tales, but stories about strength, stories about quiet courage. One day, sitting on a weathered bench, I noticed an elderly woman walking her dog. The way she moved, the slight stoop of her shoulders, triggered a powerful memory of my mother late in life. I closed my eyes, and the memory was vivid. My mother, maybe 55, sitting in the armchair, holding a needlepoint sampler. She wasn't stitching, she was just staring at the fabric. Her eyes were dull. I had walked over and asked her what was wrong. "Nothing, dear," she had murmured, the phrase that had been the soundtrack to my childhood. Just tired. But she wasn't tired from physical labor. She was tired from the continuous, internal struggle of having to absorb her husband's family scorn without ever receiving his defense. Her vibrancy, the passion she once had for painting and singing, had been extinguished drop by her husband's inaction. His silence was his betrayal. I opened my eyes, staring at the gentle current of the river. The realization solidified into granite within my mind. Mark's avoidance wasn't just a character flaw, it was the mechanism of his infidelity to our marriage vows. He had vowed to cherish and protect me, yet he was sacrificing me to preserve his image as the dutiful, guilt-ridden brother. I thought about what Leo was learning. He saw Mark come home, sullen, complaining about the expense of the B&B, but never truly apologizing to me for forcing me into the position of the villain. He was teaching Leo that when you make a hard choice, you get to blame the person who forced you to make it. He was teaching Leo that compromise means making others suffer for your convenience. That evening, Mark was meticulously cleaning the garage, a task he usually deferred until autumn. It was another form of avoidance, physical labor as emotional shield. I walked out and stood in the doorway. "Mark," I started. He flinched, not looking up from where he was sorting rusty tools. "What is it, Eliza?" "I'm busy. I have to make room for Sarah's luggage. She's bringing 5 large bags, apparently." "I want to talk about the silence," I said. He froze. "What silence?" "Your silence, Mark. The way you've been moving through the house since I sent that text. The passive aggression, the complaints about the B&B bills. You're acting like I threw a hand grenade into your life, when all I did was refuse to be the human shield you keep trying to hide behind." He finally stood up, his face set. "I am dealing with the fallout of your explosive decision. What do you want me to do? Applaud you for causing a rift with my sister? I want you to be honest about the choice you made," I demanded, stepping closer. "You had a choice, Mark. You could have stood with me last year. You could have stood with me a few days ago. You could have said, 'Sarah, we love you, but our home is not suitable for a 3-week extended stay, especially given the history with the boys. We will help you find a camp or accommodation.' You didn't. You only asked me to suffer for you." I looked straight into his weary eyes. "Your debt to Sarah is the cost of your inability to say no. And that inability, that weakness, is what I find unforgivable. Not the conflict, not the cost, the cowardice." The word hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. It was the truth that shattered the facade of their peaceful life. "Don't use that word," he warned, his voice shaking. "Don't you dare call me that." "Then show me otherwise," I challenged. "Stop complaining about the money and the driving. Stop sulking. Go to Leo, hug him, and tell him you are sorry that you put his safety in question last year. Tell him you will always protect his home. If you can't protect your wife, protect your son. That is how you prove you are not a coward." He turned away again, his shoulders slumping in defeat, not acceptance. "I need peace, Eliza. I just need peace." "You are confusing peace with stagnation, Mark. Peace is earned through honest confrontation and mutual respect. What you are seeking is emotional stasis, and you are willing to crush my spirit and risk our son's sense of security to maintain it." I left him there, among the shadows of his cluttered garage, alone with the shame and the resentment I had forced him to acknowledge. His constant search for peace had become the greatest threat to our marriage. He only wanted the surface smooth, regardless of the rut beneath. Later that afternoon, the tension had settled into a heavy, unmoving dread. Mark was working on his laptop in the living room, ostensibly remote work, but I knew he was just browsing, waiting for the time to pass. And I was in the kitchen, preparing a light dinner. Leo came in, holding a small, crumpled drawing. It wasn't the happy stick figure family from before. This one was darker. It was a house, clearly our house, but it had a huge, jagged line running right down the middle, separating the mother and son from the father. He had drawn large, dark clouds over the father's side. He held it out to me, his brow furrowed. "Mom, why is our house broken?" I knelt down, my heart clenching. I had tried so hard to shield him from the emotional fallout, But children see the architecture of feeling more clearly than adults. It's not broken, darling, I murmured, gently smoothing the paper. Sometimes, when people who love each other disagree, it feels like the house is broken. But it's not. It's just working through a difficult patch. Leo pointed to the dark clouds on Mark's side of the picture. Is Dad sad because he has to drive Owen and Finn? The simplicity of his question was devastating. He had synthesized the entire conflict into the logistics. Mark was sad because of the inconvenience. He didn't connect Mark's sadness to the fundamental rupture of trust. Dad is just tired, Leo, I lied, falling back into the old pattern, then quickly catching myself. No, I wouldn't do that. I would not teach him to excuse emotional neglect. He is working hard to make sure everyone is safe and happy this summer, I corrected, the words feeling brittle. He's working hard to keep his promise to his sister, and I'm working hard to keep my promise to you. I did not point out the line down the middle of the house. I simply held him close. The truth was, Mark's silence and resentment were radiating out, affecting the smallest, most precious thing in our life. The wounds were no longer invisible. They were manifesting in Leo's artwork. The betrayal was repeating. I watched Mark in the living room. He was utterly absorbed in his screen, oblivious to the small, crumpled paper and the heavy conversation we had just had. He was retreating into his solitary world, convinced that if he ignored the emotional reality long enough, it would dissipate. That night, after Leo was asleep, I sat by the window in the dark living room, watching Mark. He had moved from his laptop to watching a documentary. The sound turned low. He looked peaceful finally. He had achieved his momentary stasis. I realized then that the marriage I had known was over. It hadn't ended with a bang or an affair. It had ended with a slow, quiet discovery. Mark's kindness was a conditional currency, and his love was secondary to his fear of his sister. He would always choose the path of least resistance, even if that path walked straight over my heart. The distance between us was now vast. It wasn't the distance of space, but the distance of two opposing moral choices. I had chosen truth and protection. He had chosen convenience and avoidance. I didn't speak to him. I simply stood up and went to my garden, walking out onto the dew-damp grass in the dark. I stood beside my flourishing basil and my ripening tomatoes, my small, quiet harvest. I bent down and inhaled the sharp, clean scent of the basil. I had nourished these plants with water, sun, and care. I thought of Mark, inside, oblivious. I thought of the silence, the resentment, the avoidance. I nourished the life here. I nourished my son. I nourished the truth. But the question hung, sharp and cold, under the dark sky. Who nourishes me? The answer came back, clear and undeniable. Only me. The final week before Owen and Finn's scheduled arrival was dominated by Mark's meticulous, almost neurotic preparations. He was cleaning the areas they would occupy with a fervor he usually reserved for his engineering projects. He polished the floorboards, bleached the bathroom tiles, and even dusted the skirting boards. He was trying to exert control over the physical space, because the emotional space was utterly beyond his grasp. I watched this flurry of activity with detached curiosity. It was clear he was transferring his anxiety about Sarah's judgment onto the cleanliness of the house. He wanted the B&B to look immaculate, the garden tidy, the entire facade of our life to be perfect, so that Sarah would have no grounds for criticism. He was still trying to pay the emotional debt with our appearance. He never spoke about the root of the conflict, Leo's safety, my self-respect, his cowardice. He only spoke about the symptoms, the expense of the B&B, the difficulty of coordinating schedules, and the sheer volume of Sarah's luggage. She's bringing 3 cases just for the boys' clothes and toys, he announced one afternoon, throwing his hands up in frustration. I have to drive them all in one trip from the station to the B&B and then back again next week. It's ridiculous. It is, I agreed. Without heat? But remember, Mark, the luggage stays in the B&B. It does not come here, neither do they, except when you are actively supervising a day trip. My insistence on this physical boundary was the only thing keeping me anchored. I had defined the safe zone, and I would not allow it to be breached. Mark didn't look at me. She expects to have dinner here on the first night, to check in on us, I suppose, to make sure the boys are settled. She is welcome to have dinner with us, Mark, I said, but the boys will not. They will be settled in their accommodation before she arrives. Dinner is for adults only, and I will not be cooking a 3-course meal. It will be simple. If she wants to see the boys, she can visit them at the B&B, or she can wait until your scheduled activity day. He stared at me, astonished by my firmness. He had clearly hoped I would relent, or that the practical difficulties would somehow force me to surrender. You're deliberately making this difficult, he accused. I am deliberately making this clear, I corrected. This is the consequence of your choice, Mark. You chose Sarah's convenience over our boundary. This is what a boundary looks like. It's difficult for the trespasser, and it requires you to actively enforce it. I realized in that moment that I wasn't waiting for Mark to be a hero. I was simply demanding that he stop being a liability. I was fighting for my own psychological freedom, and I had to accept that my husband would only ever be a resentful bystander in my liberation. My escape continued to be the garden and the canvas. My painting was now less chaotic and more deliberate. I was painting a strong, solitary figure standing on a cliff edge, looking out at a turbulent sea. She wasn't happy, but she was entirely upright. That figure was me. I was painting the self-reliance that Mark's passive betrayal had forced upon me. I also spent crucial time with Leo. We had long, quiet talks about feelings, about setting limits, and about the importance of saying no, firmly but politely. I was doing remedial emotional work, rebuilding the security that Mark's inaction had chipped away. I was actively teaching Leo the opposite of my mother's silent inheritance. If someone asks you to share your toy and you don't want to, what do you say, Leo? I say, no thank you, Owen, I'm playing with it now. He would rehearse, his voice clear. And if they get angry, I walk away and find Mom or Dad. And if Dad is busy, I find Mom, he would say, his small hand reaching for mine. That small gesture, I find Mom, was both a victory and a profound disappointment. A victory that he knew I was his reliable port, but a disappointment that he had already learned not to fully rely on his father when the real tension arrived. As the day of arrival approached, Mark became more volatile. He was sleeping poorly, haunted by the specter of his sister's wrath. He started drinking a glass of whiskey after work, something he rarely did. One evening, he came into the kitchen smelling faintly of alcohol and sat heavily at the table. I had a long talk with Sarah today, he slurred slightly. She's still so hurt, Eliza. She sees this as a deep rejection. She thinks you're destroying our family bond. She's entitled to her feelings, Mark, I responded, scrubbing a pot. But her feelings don't dictate our reality. You need to stop being her spokesperson to me. You need to ask yourself if you've considered my feelings of being rejected and undermined last summer. He didn't answer. He simply put his head down in his hands, defeated. I hate being caught in the middle. I wish I could just disappear until the end of the month. That is the literal definition of the betrayal, Mark, I said, turning to face him, the dishcloth still in my hand. You want to disappear. You want the conflict to vanish. And you want me to be the one to bear the consequence of your disappearance. You want to escape the responsibility of being a husband and a father who defends his home. My voice was low and steady, devoid of anger, which made the indictment even more powerful. It wasn't an attack. It was a diagnosis. He lifted his head, his eyes bleary and wounded. What happened to us, Eliza? We used to be a team. You used to be the one who understood family obligations. I do understand family obligations, Mark. That's why I'm fighting to protect our primary family obligation, Leo. And I am fighting to uphold my vow of self-respect. What happened to us is that I discovered your definition of team means that when the pressure comes, I am the one who gets thrown off the sled. I walked over to the cabinet and took out a small, framed photo. It was a picture of me and Mark from our wedding day. 10 years ago, we were radiant, laughing. I placed it gently on the table between us. Look at this, Mark. You look brave here. You look like a man ready to face the world with me. That man is still in there, I know it. But he's trapped under the rubble of your old guilt and your fear of your sister. And until you dig him out, until you face Sarah and tell her, this is my family now, and this is where the boundary stands, you will only ever be a compromised half-partner. The physical preparation for the visit continued, but the emotional battle lines were fully drawn. Mark was resigned to the B&B arrangement, but he was resentful. He was complying with my boundary, but he was not agreeing with it. This distinction was vital. It meant that the core problem, his lack of courage in our defense, remained unresolved, merely postponed. The night before the arrival, Mark was quiet and tense. He packed a small overnight bag for himself. Why are you packing a bag? I asked, confused. I told Sarah I'd stay with them at the B&B tomorrow night. Just the first night. To help them settle. To show her I'm still on her side, I suppose. He didn't meet my eyes. My heart sank, a slow, sickening plummet. This was his final, quiet act of emotional betrayal enacted too. I had created the boundary, and he was deliberately, unnecessarily stepping outside of it to reinforce his loyalty to the opposition. You are choosing to sleep 3 miles away from your wife and son, on the first night of your nephew's visit, to placate your sister, I stated, the realization stripping away the last vestige of my optimism. You are sending her a very clear message, Mark, and it's not the message of a man committed to his home. He looked desperate. It's one night, Eliza. It's diplomatic. It'll make the rest of the summer easier. No, Mark. It makes the rest of the summer meaningless, I whispered, turning away. Because you are proving that the peace you seek is always external, always defined by Sarah's happiness, never by our safety. You are choosing your old debt over the simple, daily act of being present for your family. I knew then that I could not win the marriage back by winning the argument. I could only win my life back by detaching from his choices. I let him go. I let him pack his bag and walk out the door the next morning to pick up Owen and Finn, his shoulders heavy with self-imposed martyrdom. I was left alone in the quiet, boundary-protected house with Leo. I sat on the sofa, breathing in the silence. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the quiet of a field after the battle has passed, leaving only the wounded and the survivors. I had won the battle for the summer, but I had lost the war for my partnership. And now, I had to figure out what to do with the victory and the profound emptiness it left behind. Mark left early that morning, his goodbye brief and heavy, with a silent accusation. He took Leo's hand and kissed him quickly, but his eyes avoided mine. He was off to collect Owen and Finn from the train station, deliver them to the B&B, and perform his act of diplomatic martyrdom by staying overnight. His departure, rather than bringing relief, left a chilling void. The house was finally quiet, but it was the silence of a structure that had been evacuated, not one that had found peace. I spent the day with Leo. We went to the park, not the busy playground, but the quieter walled garden where the elderly gardeners tended roses. Leo played freely, stacking pebbles and running on the grass. He was relaxed. He laughed, a genuine, unrestrained sound that I hadn't heard much of in the tense preceding weeks. He was safe. The boundary worked. The immediate threat of Owen's unkindness and Finn's destruction was contained 3 miles away. But as I watched Leo, feeling the success of my resolve, a profound sorrow settled over me. I had protected my son from external threat, but I had failed to protect my marriage from internal erosion. Mark's absence was a physical manifestation of his emotional abandonment. He was not here, by choice. He was choosing to sleep on an uncomfortable B&B mattress to soothe his sister's bruised ego rather than sleep beside his wife and son to mend his fractured family. I realized I wasn't grieving the loss of a perfect marriage. I was grieving the loss of the potential of the man I loved, the man who existed only in my memory, the brave, decisive man from our wedding photo. The man I was married to now was a slave to fear, and I had effectively divorced him in my heart when he closed the door on his way to the B&B. The dinner with Sarah was scheduled for 7 p.m. It was not a celebratory meal. It was a diplomatic negotiation. I refused to let it be a performance. I cooked a simple risotto with the tomatoes and basil from my garden, a meal that represented my quiet, self-sustained life. No fuss, no extravagance, no attempt to placate. I dressed simply, in a dark navy dress, projecting quiet competence rather than nervous warmth. I wanted to be a wall, not a comfort. Sarah arrived precisely on time. She walked in alone, impeccably dressed, carrying a bottle of expensive red wine she clearly expected me to open immediately. Her smile was tight, her eyes cold and analytical, scanning the house for flaws. She was conducting a quality control inspection. "Eliza," she greeted, her voice a practiced mixture of civility and condescension. "It's so thoughtful of you to have me for dinner, even with everything going on." Everything going on was her euphemism for my outrageous boundary setting. "Please come in, Sarah. Dinner will be ready soon," I said, not taking the wine. "Mark is still settling the boys in. He should be here shortly." She glanced around the tidy living room. "Yes, Mark told me about the B&B. Such a shame. You have so much space here, I just don't understand the need for the inconvenience. Mark looks utterly exhausted from all the running around. The inconvenience is temporary, Sarah, I replied, moving past her to the kitchen. The peace for Leo is permanent, and Mark is managing his responsibilities. He volunteered to handle the logistics. So he is. She followed me, leaning against the kitchen island, a pose of relaxed scrutiny. She was trying to unsettle me with her proximity. He feels terrible, you know. He really does. He feels torn between his sister and his wife. I told him he should never have put you in the middle like this. She paused, the subtle manipulation arriving. But then, Mark is a kind man. Too kind, perhaps. He finds it impossible to tell people no when they need him. No, Sarah, I said, turning the risotto carefully. Mark is a man who finds it impossible to tell you no. That is a crucial difference. And his inability to say no to you translates directly into his inability to defend his wife and son. That is not kindness. That is a structural failing. The air crackled. I had called out the manipulation directly, refusing to play the victim or the aggressor. I was just the truth teller. Sarah dropped her smile. Her face hardened. You've changed, Eliza. You're cold. You're punitive. I don't know who you are anymore. I haven't changed, Sarah. I've simply stopped being silent. I've stopped paying for Mark's convenience with my own well-being, and I refuse to teach Leo that his mother is a woman who accepts disrespect. This is not about you or me. This is about cutting the chain of unspoken suffering. The door opened then, saving her from a reply. Mark walked in, looking like a man who had just escaped a prison riot. He was pale and tense. Sarah, Eliza, he muttered, his voice strained. He didn't look at me, but his eyes immediately went to Sarah, seeking her approval, her absolution. Mark, darling, you look shattered, Sarah cooed, instantly softening her demeanor and shifting her attack. The boys are fine, just a bit rowdy, but you shouldn't have to sleep in that stuffy B&B. It's ridiculous. She looked pointedly at me, inviting Mark to join her side against the cold wife. Mark stood in the doorway, caught between the two moral forces. For a long, painful moment, I saw the battle play out on his face. The yearning for Sarah's forgiveness, the guilt about his own debt, and the deep-seated resentment toward me for forcing him into this choice. Then he spoke. He didn't look at Sarah, he looked at the floor, and his voice was flat, empty of emotion, but absolutely final. I'm staying at the B&B tonight, Sarah. I'll be back home tomorrow morning. It was a terrible, beautiful moment. Terrible because he was confirming his choice to physically abandon our home for a night. Beautiful because he had just refused Sarah's invitation to break the boundary I had established. He had enforced the rule. He was following my direction, even if he resented the map. Sarah's face went rigid with fury. She knew she had been rejected, not by my words, but by Mark's begrudging action. The dinner was a miserable affair. Sarah talked mostly about her successes in London, occasionally dropping loaded questions about my teaching job or my decision to only have one child. Mark contributed only short, tense answers, clearly wishing the earth would swallow him whole. I remained a pillar of quiet, polite resilience, deflecting every passive-aggressive jab with simple, unadorned truth. As Sarah stood to leave, she paused at the door, her eyes burning into mine. I truly hope you know what you're doing, Eliza. I hope this peace you're so determined to win is worth the cost of the resentment you've created in your husband. I met her gaze without flinching. I know exactly what the cost is, Sarah. It's the cost of a fragile lie, and it's worth it because I'm stopping the wounds from repeating in the next generation. That is a price worth paying. She left without a word, slamming the gate shut behind her. Mark returned from walking her to the car, his face dark. He picked up his bag. I'm leaving now, he said curtly. I know, I replied. He hesitated, standing in the middle of the living room. I did what you asked, Eliza. I told her I was staying. You won. I didn't ask you to leave tonight, Mark. I asked you to stand with me. You chose to sleep in a strange bed to prove your loyalty to your sister over your commitment to your home. That isn't winning. That's surviving. And you are surviving alone. He sighed, a deep, ragged sound of exhaustion and self-pity. I'll see you in the morning. He walked out. The door clicked shut. I stood there for a long moment, the silence rushing back in, but this time, it felt different. It was no longer the silence of expectation or dread. It was the silence of absolute freedom. I walked to Leo's room. He was fast asleep, his face peaceful, his small hand tucked under his cheek. His toys were safe. His room was his fortress. I kissed his forehead. Then I walked to the garden. I sat on the bench, looking at the stars and the silhouette of my painting, the solitary figure standing upright against the storm. I was no longer my mother. I had refused the legacy of quiet suffering. I had protected my son. I had found my voice. The victory was mine, but in the profound, crushing quiet of the house, I realized my victory had come at the price of my marriage's illusion. Mark was gone, physically and emotionally. I was standing on my own cliff edge, finally upright, but utterly alone. And Act 2 ended there, in the terrifying, exhilarating solitude of self-possession. I spent the first night of the summer holidays in utter solitude. But it was not a grieving solitude, it was a solitude of self-possession. I slept alone, in the large double bed, and for the first time in years, I didn't need to curl up, making myself small to make room for Mark's avoidance and internal conflict. The emptiness beside me was not a loss, but a space for the truth and for stillness. I woke up before dawn the next morning. I felt neither tired nor angry, only a cold, sharp lucidity. I went downstairs, made coffee, and took it out to the garden. I sat on the old bench, sipping the bitterness of the coffee and breathing in the scent of the damp soil. The first light of day touched the basil leaves, illuminating their vibrant green. I took out my phone and reread Sarah's message from days before, that arrogant list of orders. Don't be stingy. Separate menu for each. Must take them out. Last week, those lines had caused shock and rage. Today, they were merely evidence. Evidence of Sarah's manipulative nature and Mark's silent acquiescence. I realized the truth I had avoided throughout Act 2. The problem was not Sarah. She was just a tool, a catalyst. She was merely the one making the demands. But the person who allowed the wound to happen was Mark. The real issue, the core fracture, lay between him and me. It was our marriage. Mark had made his priorities clear by his actions. He had chosen to sleep at the B&B, choosing to stand on diplomatic ground with his sister, rather than staying in the home he called a sanctuary to support his wife and son. He had chosen fear of the past over responsibility for the present. This was the protracted injustice. It was not just the sister-in-law's offense, it was the husband's betrayal. I was no longer angry, I was only left with clarity. Anger is a hot, consuming emotion, but clarity is a cold, sharp weapon. I knew what I had to do. I had protected Leo by setting up a physical barrier. Now, I had to protect myself by setting up a permanent spiritual barrier with Mark. I had to break the cycle decisively. When Mark returned home late that morning, he looked even more haggard. He wasn't just tired from lack of sleep. He was exhausted from internal conflict and evasion. He carried the smell of old hotel and an unmistakable sense of strain. He walked into the house and saw me calmly watering plants in the garden. I was planting a new row of lettuce. I was creating life. He was bringing back the death of connection. "Hello," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm back." "Hello, Mark," I replied, my tone neutral, neither angry nor welcoming. "Is everything all right?" "Fine," he said shortly. Sarah talked for a long time. She's still angry, but she accepted the B&B. I've scheduled the activities for tomorrow. I'm taking them to Bristol Castle. He was still playing the role of the messenger and the logistics manager. He was waiting for my approval, or worse, my sympathy. "Good," I said, placing the watering hose into a bucket. "Now we need to talk, Mark. Not about Sarah or the boys, about us." He hunched his shoulders, as if bracing for a physical blow. "Eliza, please, I'm exhausted. Can we just let this go for a while?" "No," I insisted. "You chose to leave this house to sleep the night with your fear. You chose to side with the person who publicly insulted me. You chose to prioritize your sister's peace of mind over your son's security. Last night wasn't a diplomatic event. It was a statement." I stood up, facing him, slightly taller than him because he was standing hunched over. "What statement?" he asked, avoiding my gaze. "The statement that we are no longer a team, Mark," I said. "You have a debt to Sarah. That is true. But you are asking Leo and me to pay that debt with our own sacrifice. When I refused, you left. You want family peace. But you want Sarah's peace more than you want mine. You want your own comfort more than my self-respect." I stepped closer, not shouting, not blaming, just the sharp, cold truth. "You owe your sister, but I owe no one." That was my first, absolute refusal. The refusal to pay a debt that wasn't mine. "You're exaggerating," he burst out, his voice edged with panic. I was just trying to make things easier. Easier for whom, Mark? Easier for you. Easier to avoid an uncomfortable confrontation with Sarah. But that made life difficult and unjust for Leo and me. I looked at him, remembering the image of Leo holding the picture of the divided house. You know, I continued, I grew up watching my mother being invisibly abandoned by my father. She wasn't abandoned by infidelity or violence. She was abandoned by his silence. I promised myself I wouldn't repeat that. But when you stood by silently while Sarah called me cold, and when you allowed our son to be blamed for breaking property, you repeated that exact betrayal. And when I finally stood up to defend myself, you chose to go sleep in a B&B to prove to your sister that I was the bad guy, the disruptor. You are recreating that cycle of sacrifice and cowardice. And most importantly, you are passing it on to Leo. I placed my hand on his shoulder, a gesture not of affection, but of compulsion, forcing him to listen. Leo drew a picture of our house split in two, Mark. He learned that when things get difficult, his father leaves. That is the legacy you are leaving your son. That is the wound you are passing to the next generation. I cannot stop Sarah from betraying us, but I can stop that wound from repeating through Leo. He stepped back, his defensive posture crumbling into defeat. He raised his hands to cover his face, his fingers trembling. For the first time, he couldn't evade the truth, and it was hitting him hard. I didn't mean to, he choked out. I don't know how to deal with her. That's no reason to sacrifice your family, Mark, I said coldly. I had hoped you would say, I'm sorry, Eliza, you're right. I chose my own convenience. I will stay home. I will protect this house and our son. But you didn't say that. You chose to go sleep 3 miles away. Therefore, I said, my voice hardening and becoming absolute, I have made a decision. We are not hosting the boys this year. He removed his hands from his face, staring at me in shock. What? But they're already here. I rented the B&B. She flew here. You rented the B&B, I confirmed. But you failed to protect our home and our peace. I gave you a chance to stand up. You refused. So, I will finalize the severing of this cycle. I had already sent the final message to Sarah at 11 a.m. when she was on her way to the B&B to check on the boys. The message was brief and professional, similar to the last one, but more definitive. Sarah, upon further consideration of the situation and the stress Mark is currently under, we believe this arrangement is not beneficial for anyone, especially the boys. We are obligated to withdraw our offer of care. We will cover the full cost of the B&B for the 3 weeks and any associated costs. Mark will remain available to drive the boys as needed. We apologize for the inconvenience, but we must prioritize Leo's well-being. I looked at Mark, who was reading the message on his phone. What have you done? He whispered. His voice no longer angry, just stunned. I have done what you should have done, I said. I chose to protect my son. What about you, Mark? Will you choose to stay here with me and our son, or will you run to the B&B to comfort your sister and lament this injustice? Mark stood rigid, his overnight bag dangling from his hand, suspended between the kitchen doorway and the garden entrance, utterly paralyzed. His shock upon reading the text I sent Sarah was not rage at being usurped, but horror at seeing his mechanism of evasion destroyed. He had calculated paying the debt with inconvenience, but I had forced him to pay it with the truth itself. You can't do this, Eliza, he whispered, his voice stripped of threat, leaving only despair. You can't. She flew all the way here. The boys are at the B&B. You're ruining everything. You ruined everything, Mark. The moment you chose to leave this house to sleep the night with your fear, I retorted, my voice maintaining its chilling calm. You cast the deciding vote for the collapse of this family. I am merely counting the ballots. Now my question still stands. Will you choose to stay here with me and our son, or will you run to the B&B to comfort your sister and lament this injustice? He offered no reply. He bolted out of the house. The car engine roared to life, and the tires squealed angrily on the tarmac, carrying him toward the B&B. He had chosen, or at least, he had chosen to evade me in favor of confronting the person he feared more. I let out a quiet sigh of relief. The first confrontation was over. I sat down, gazing at my unfinished painting. The woman on the cliff was still standing upright. About half an hour later, my phone began to vibrate. It was Sarah. I let it ring 3 times, then pressed the answer button. Eliza, what is the meaning of this? Her voice was as sharp as broken glass. devoid of any feigned civility. "Hello, Sarah," I said calmly. I believe the message was quite clear. We are withdrawing our offer of care. I apologize for the inconvenience, but we must prioritize Leo's well-being. Prioritize what? What are you people doing? Mark said he booked the B&B. He organized everything. This is an insult. Why are you doing this? To punish me. You have always been jealous of me. Sarah, I cut her off, my voice even and authoritative, refusing to yield to her emotion. This is not personal. This is about family boundaries. I told Mark we could not endure another stressful summer, and I would not allow my son to face injustice. Mark was unable to make that decision. I made it for him. "You are manipulating him," she screamed. "You are isolating him from his family. He slept over here last night just to prove he still cares." "He chose to sleep there, Sarah, to prove he cared more about your feelings than the stability of his own family," I corrected coldly. That action showed me his priorities, and that is why we are forced to withdraw our offer of care. You have 3.5 weeks left in Bristol. You can hire a full-time carer, or you can hire a car and take them out yourself. We will cover the full cost of the B&B, but I will not allow your instability to harm my son any longer. I did not wait for a response. I hung up. I had spoken the final word. I had completed the severing. In that moment, I felt an extreme sense of release. I no longer had to fear the phone, the knock, or Sarah's judgment. The confrontation had happened, and I had stood firm. I had refused the legacy of silence. About 4 hours later, Mark returned. This time, he didn't drive in angrily. He parked slowly and walked into the house, wearing a vacant, almost shattered expression. He had faced a full-scale emotional meltdown from Sarah, and he had been forced to face the fact that I had won. He put his overnight bag on the floor and slumped onto the sofa. He didn't look at me. "She was crying," he said, his voice no longer in accusation, but sheer exhaustion. "She said she doesn't know what to do. She said you've cut him off from her, that you've completely isolated him." I sat opposite him, on the facing chair. "Mark, I sent you a very clear message. You owe your sister, but I owe no one. I tried to shield you from your own fear. You chose to follow that fear. You chose to abandon me and our son. So what do you want, Eliza?" he burst out, finally looking at me, his eyes free of avoidance for the first time in days. "You've gotten what you wanted. Sarah will be gone in 3.5 weeks. Everything will go back to normal. Why can't you just let it be?" "Because I don't want to go back to normal, Mark," I said. And these were the most painful words I had ever uttered. Our normal was a marriage where I continuously shrank myself so you could be comfortable. Our normal was the silent acceptance of your invisible betrayal. I cannot go back there. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the quiet garden. "You didn't betray me by having an affair. You betrayed me by lacking the courage to defend me. You betrayed me by prioritizing your fear over my value. That is a far deeper form of betrayal." I turned back. I realized last night, when you left, I had finally freed myself from my mother's fear, from the legacy of silence. But I did it without you. I won a fight where you should have been my partner, but you chose to be the opposing side's mediator. I walked over to the small table where Leo had left the drawing of the divided house. I picked it up and placed it in front of Mark. Leo drew this. He saw the crack. He saw you leave. He learned the lesson I learned from my own parents. When things are difficult, the husband disappears, and that is the legacy you are passing onto your son. Mark took the picture, his fingers trembling over the pencil-drawn fracture line. Tears began to stream down his worn face. They weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of breakdown, the breakdown of his entire illusion. "So what do you want?" he choked out. "What do you want me to do now?" I sat down opposite him. "I want you to be honest, Mark. Honest with yourself and honest with me. You don't want to be here. You don't want to face Sarah's disappointment. You don't want to face my anger. You just want everything to be quiet and stable. But I am not stable. I have changed. I am no longer the woman who will shrink herself to be a human shield for your cowardice. I need to know, can you become the man I married? The one with the courage to stand up and defend his wife and son? Or will you forever be the man afraid of his past shadows?" I looked at him, waiting. This was the defining question of the marriage. Not about Sarah, not about money, but about character and integrity. Mark bowed his head. "You're asking for something I don't know if I can give you, Eliza. I don't know how to fight her. I don't know how to live in this tension." His confession, simple and raw, closed the final door of my hope. He wasn't a bad man, he was simply a man incapable of the necessary courage to be my partner. Then we cannot continue, Mark, I said, my voice dropping low, but no longer anguished. I cannot live with a man who chooses to evade me in times of crisis. I cannot let Leo learn from your absence. We cannot heal, because you are unwilling to learn how to fight. What are you saying? He asked, looking up, genuine fear showing in his eyes for the first time. I'm talking about separation, Mark, I said. This is my home and Leo's home. You can stay for these 3 weeks if you want, but we will be living separately, and after Sarah leaves, we need to speak to a solicitor. I cannot pay your debt any longer. I am fully free, and I must find a life without your evasion. My declaration of separation did not cause an explosion. It caused a collapse. Mark didn't react with anger or argumentation, but with utter paralysis. His face, already worn from avoidance, was now completely vacant, like a wall stripped of its final layer of plaster. He didn't cry again. He simply sat there, staring blankly at Leo's drawing of the divided house. "What are you doing, Eliza?" he whispered, his voice now devoid of all defensiveness. "We have Leo. We have this home. We can't keep pretending this house is a safe place when you are constantly ready to abandon it whenever pressure arrives," I said, my voice softening, not from regret, but from deep sorrow. "You weren't willing to fight for it, Mark. I gave you the chance. The last 2 days were the final test, and you failed. You chose superficial comfort over hard truth." He couldn't deny it. His earlier weak confession, "I don't know how to live in this tension," had become his admission of guilt and his final verdict. I gave him the remaining 2.5 weeks to live in the house, a strange arrangement to maintain stability for Leo and to complete the care arrangement for Owen and Finn. Mark agreed in silence. He put away his overnight bag, but he never returned to our bed. He moved into the home office, turning it into his private sanctuary. Life for the next 2.5 weeks proceeded in a strained silence that I called the silence of fate. Mark continued his driving duties. He took Owen and Finn to camps and activity centers, paid for them, and brought them back to the B&B in the evening. He fulfilled the role of logistical manager without complaint. His compliance was not an act of repentance, but an acceptance of his destiny. He was completing his part in the play, while I was rewriting the script. I lived a parallel life. I taught Leo how to swim at the local pool. I finished my painting. The woman on the cliff was no longer looking out at the stormy sea, but tilting her face towards the clear sky, accepting solitude. I worked in the garden, tending my vegetable beds with the meticulousness of someone rebuilding their own foundation. I didn't ask him about Sarah or the boys. He didn't ask me about Leo or my work. Our communication was limited to, "Has Leo gone to sleep?" and "We're out of milk." This distance, though painful, brought a strange serenity. Finally, I no longer had to care what he was thinking, feeling, or how he was going to betray me next. I had the truth, and that truth was liberation. A few days before Sarah and the boys were due to leave, Sarah's final fury erupted. Mark came home after a particularly strained afternoon, looking like he'd been dragged through a storm. "She wants to talk to you," he said, his voice barely audible. "She's calling you at 8 p.m. She says you owe her an explanation." "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her it was your decision, that you felt hurt by what happened last year, and you needed to protect Leo," he said, simply repeating my talking points, but without any conviction of his own. "I told her she should respect your boundary." "And how did she take that?" "She said, you're having a breakdown. She said you are destroying your marriage and using your son as an excuse. She said she wants to talk to you one last time. She said she wants me to choose." At 8 o'clock that evening, the phone rang. I answered immediately. "Eliza," Sarah's voice was cold, sharp, carrying all her accustomed arrogance. "I hope you're ready to listen. I told Mark this is his last chance. You can be the stubborn woman, or you can be the reasonable wife. You've caused enough distress. You can retract your statement and arrange a proper apology. If not, you will lose him. Do you choose me or separation?" She had issued an absolute ultimatum, a final attempt to re-establish the old order, where I was the quiet, easily replaced woman. I gave a small, quiet laugh. The sound was not of humor, but of pity. "Sarah," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "I haven't chosen. Mark chose. He chose to sleep in a B&B rather than stay home with his son. He chose silence and fear rather than honesty and courage. He chose external harmony over internal integrity. Mark is not being lost. He is the one who chose to be absent. And let me tell you something you may never understand. My marriage didn't break because of your presence. It broke because of my husband's absence. You no longer hold the power to threaten me, Sarah. I don't envy you, I pity you. You taught Mark that he had to pay a price for your love, and in the end, that price was his marriage. I paused, letting the words sink in. And yes, I have separated from him because I cannot let Leo learn that love is continuous sacrifice. You have wounded me for the last time. I wish you a safe flight. I hung up. It was the final refusal. I had completely severed the connection to the Vance family cycle of trauma. The next day, Mark drove Sarah and the boys to the airport. He went alone. When he returned, he carried the fatigue of a man who had just buried a part of his life. He placed his car keys on the table. He walked into the office, his new quarters. Then, he came back and stood in the kitchen doorway, where we had the last confrontation. She told me everything, he said, his voice ragged. She told me what you said. And what do you think? I asked, washing the dishes. She was right, he admitted, a painful confession. She was right about you manipulating. You forced my hand. But you were right about everything else. He took a deep breath. She was right that I chose absence. I was more afraid of Sarah's disappointment than I was of the crack in your heart. I saw Leo's drawing. I understand. I was not brave enough to protect this home. He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw a final, sad acceptance. I'll start clearing out the office this weekend. I'll look for a flat. We'll talk to Leo together. You were right. You can't go back to normal. I turned to him. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, only truth. Thank you, Mark, I said. Thank you for that honesty. It's the only thing you can give me now. Leo's summer continued in absolute peace. I spent time with him, planting, reading, and finishing the painting. The canvas was finally titled, The Inheritance of Silence, a testament that I had not passed on my mother's silence to my son. Weeks later, after Mark had moved out, I sat alone in the garden in the evening. The scent of basil and jasmine was strong. Leo was asleep in his room, safe and sound. I breathed deeply, feeling the solitude, but it was the solitude of freedom. I had lost my husband, but I had found myself. I had successfully severed the chain of silence and sacrifice. My mother's wound had stopped with me, never to pass to Leo. I had kept my promise to my little boy. And in that small, quiet garden, at the end of the summer, I finally found the peace I had longed for. A peace that was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of integrity and self-possessed courage.